There has been an update to the Stephen Smith case. Stephen Smith's car was not out of gas. It was low on gas, but not out of gas. I have been told that members of the police department have driven Stephen's car. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Forensic Friday. I am Shannon, your host, and my co-host, Kelly. Kelly, say hi.
Hey.
We are here covering Stephen Smith Part 2, and we're going to go over the forensic evidence, what they did collect, what they didn't collect, what they should have collected, and what they did with what they collected. So the first thing mentioned in Part 1 that I thought in statements, as far as what Stephen was wearing and things that really bothers me, is that Lieutenant Singleton, he said when he saw Stephen, he was wearing a white polo. Now, every other report, even the photos taken, Stephen is in a black Nike athletic shirt, kind of like a dry fit material. Could it be a typo? Absolutely. But it may not be. And since there's no supplemental report to it, no, it's not amended in any way, it's not corrected or even acknowledged, to me, it still said white polo, which is a completely different shirt than black. So that's one thing that I'm going to touch on right off the bat, that there's somebody, first person to arrive there, and that's what they see, and no one else sees the same thing. So that bothers me. Kelly, what you could go on with what you want to cover. I just wanted to spit that out.
The paint chips, that was a part of this too. And we did find in the mate report, which we'll go through in a greater detail in a later episode, but it does seem that there were, I guess it doesn't give you great detail, but some sort of small paint chips on his shorts and his shirt, from what I could tell. But we don't know where on the shirt. Oh, and on his shoes. But we don't know if it was on the front, the back. I mean, that would make a difference.
10 1mm single layer blue paint chips done by when they were investigated and tested and looked at. And the paint could be from an industrial tool, a dumpster, or a signpost. And also Toyota used that particular color on vehicles from 1982 to 1988. Does that mean a Toyota hit him? Not necessarily. Kelly, we talked about this in Part 1. He was laying in the road. Natural particles from cars could be in that road that could have been on him simply because he was laying in the road.
Absolutely.
And
or even, I mean, it's completely possible. We don't know where he was earlier that night.
Good point.
In regards to Stephen's head trauma, I found it confusing because when you look at his head and the pictures when he's on the road, the only thing that I really was able to see was the skin was lifted. It looked as though he was hit and everything went up that way. It did not look as though the back of his head was caved in when they took pictures of his body at the site. However, when they did go later to the funeral home to take pictures, there's a huge gash in sort of the back, the top of his head, which would make me think that possibly he was hit from above. But then I went into thinking there's so many details that are missing. One, I don't do autopsies. I don't work in a funeral home. So I don't know if that divot in the skull that I saw was due to, I mean, not to get gory, but they take organs out. They take bodily fluids out when you're in a place like that. So I don't know if that would cause that part of a person's head to collapse, especially if it was fractured. Maybe that would, I mean, there's nothing, if you don't have anything underneath it to hold it up and it's got a crack in it, maybe that would cause it to cave in. But that was kind of confusing. But then you do have to wonder. So if it was cracked there, was it cracked because he fell back or was it cracked because he hit it? And that's stuff that only probably a really great forensic person that they hopefully will hire will be able to tell us, because it's certainly not in the report, but it is very confusing. And when I've read reports on this in other places, they do talk about the big divot in the back of his head, the divot that you can see, but it's very confusing because I'm not sure what would have caused that.
Exactly. That's just it. The report, whether it be the autopsy report or this MATE file, is lacking so much information. And I believe that's because of the way it was investigated. When you do look at Stephen's face, I believe that is where the accident happened. I believe that's where he took his last breath. He died with his eyes open. You can see the expirated spatter, that what it appears to me, I am not a forensic blood spatter specialist, that he was coughing up the bodily fluids that were building in his throat and in his lungs, and he was coughing. So I do believe he took his last breath there. It just hits my gut that his eyes were open. He saw what was happening to him, and that really, really bothers me. And whoever is guilty of this, well, I'm going to try to be a lady and say
I
nothing.
hope they figure it out. I hope that we get answers. I will say last night, out of curiosity, because we've kind of gone back and forth about like the markings that were on his arm and on his hands, and even some of them on his face, I was trying to look at other examples of road rash. And I could see most of the examples that you find online are usually the more extreme examples of that. So based on some of those markings, I could see how it's possible they could be possibly road rash, but it didn't look exactly like it. So that's another thing I would really love to hear about that from somebody who has seen maybe hundreds of examples of this and can be like, I recognize that pattern. I've seen other things like that. That's what this is. But they're certainly peculiar. Understand that things with skin do sometimes take time to develop. You can have like a light scratch that you can't even see on you, and in a few hours it can be a very red scratch, and it just depends on each person. And I will say Stephen was very fair, he would be someone whose skin would highly react. So I wonder, could those light scrapings on his face even have come from, is it possible, could that have come even from a material that could have, because they're pretty light type of scrapings. They're not deep. It's very surface. Is it possible at some point there could have been maybe even like a burlap bag or something over his head that could have caused mild scrapes like that? I don't know, but it's something to think about. And it's just so interesting to me, like when you're talking about somebody getting, hit and how they're going to land, it's very strange to me that you'd see very, like, we're not talking like curvy scratches at all. These are very straight scratches that go up his face. And then there's some of them that will go completely like that's not, there's no like in between, or it's very somewhat organized with the exactness of it. So we don't know that he wasn't kidnapped at his car and taken there. That's a possibility. Who knows? Maybe he got pulled out of his car or taken somewhere.
Going back to what you were saying from the pictures you saw that were taken at the funeral home and the pictures that were taken at the crime scene, there is definite bruising that happens to the body even after death. That can come out later. So that could be the discrepancy on it. But it is odd how you see absolutely nothing at the crime scene. That some parts of his face don't even show that they've been touched. And then later at the funeral home photos, you can see definite bruising and markings on him. So to me, you're right. It was a little odd just how much was there in one scene and completely not in the other. And just to reiterate from previous comments, the reason why the highway patrol was at the funeral home taking photos is because SLED had told them, you're not needed at the autopsy. We're taking this over. We're at the autopsy. You don't need to be there. And there are members of the highway patrol that were very upset, that definitely thought this was a homicide and not a hit and run. And they wanted photos of the body of Stephen to continue their investigation. So they contacted the funeral home and they showed up there to take their own photos. So that's why we're talking about these type of photos at the funeral home. I don't think that's a normal thing to do, but they were just trying to gather their evidence as well.
And thank goodness they did, because it was really helpful to see, like when you've been you can see things later that you wouldn't, like you were saying, initially see. You might be able to see bruising from like when somebody was grabbed harshly, because it does take a lot of show. So with Stephen's car, what forensic processes were used? I don't know of any, to be honest. In fact, the last I checked, when I was looking through the report, it had been impounded, and the investigator had to go to, I think, like the highway patrol impounding area, and he ended up taking pictures and looking there, which is how we were able to look to see what was actually in his car, if anything was interesting there. We don't know if they ever checked to find out if his car was really out of gas. We don't know if they checked fingerprints on the gas, the cap on the gas tank, which would have been interesting. Like if there was any foul play, perhaps somebody did that to make it look like he was out of gas.
Because just the gas cap was out, and we've already touched on this, just, was he, just because you take the gas cap off does not mean you're out of gas. Was the gas funneled out? We'll never know, because we haven't really heard that it was actually out of gas. They just are assuming that because of the gas cap. There has been an update to the Stephen Smith case. Stephen Smith's car was not out of gas. It was low on gas, but not out of gas. I have been told that members of the police department have driven Stephen's car. You could say, well, maybe it was engine trouble. And Stephanie had made a statement earlier when she was being interviewed that they had just redone all the engine parts. They kind of did an upgrade on the car. So there was no reason for anyone to believe that there was any kind of engine trouble. And people have said, well, Stephanie mentioned Stephen used to run out of gas. No, Stephen used to run out of gas in the SUV that he used to drive. She did not say he used to run out of gas in the car that was driven the night that he died. Now, after watching the Murdoch trial, we have learned so much about cell phone and the data collected from the cell phone. Kelly, you did a lot of reading on this last night. Why don't you tell us what you have found out or didn't find out regarding Stephen's cell phone?
What I found regarding his cell phone was a question that I had earlier was, well, why didn't they just pull his records? If they were having trouble getting into the iPhone, you should be able to legally request the phone records. And they did. There was a warrant in the file showing that they did request the cell phone records. And as far as it looks, that's all that was there. There was no follow-up, nothing. So I suppose if there is any information, it would just be from they would have had to have gotten it from the iPad if it was unlocked, which it seems like they did try to do as well.
Yes, they did do a data collection on the iPad that does even state in the file that they looked into it. So you could tell that they did receive it. We were able to see a text or a message in the iPad, a couple of them that actually came in on the 5th, which would have been just a matter of hours, just a day or so before Stephen's death. And it just says on the 28th, iPad download. They did do a download of the iPad. And at 11:50 on the 5th, there was a message, do not come, an NBSP. And I have found out that means no bullshit, please. And then there was another one in Spanish. I will not try to say it in Spanish, but I will tell you it translates to, frankly, I want to go home. The heat is killing me. On Stephen's iPad, they do have a data collection. And I do know that one of the original attorneys for Stephen Smith, he had hired an investigator. And it is said that that investigator picked up the CD of possibly this data dump. It's alleged, but that's the knowledge that I've gathered, that he did collect a CD of these items. Going back to what we were talking about, the forensics that are available on the cell phone, where you ping from for your location, your cell phone calls, emails, if they're on your cell phone, all the different, your text messages, all these different things that can be subpoenaed and asked for if they can't get into the phone, which at all accounts appears that they may have been able to get in. But there's also an incredible amount of resources available if Stephen's social media was subpoenaed. And in the mate report, Stephanie does mention that the night that he was murdered, he was taking cell phone photos in the hot tub. And it would be very interesting to know someone who was so much on social media and posting. Did he post that night? And where did he post it to? What were the comments? What time were they posted? All of this, I think, would be an incredible amount of knowledge if they would subpoena his social media records. Kelly, what do you think of that?
I think that would be incredibly helpful too. There's always when you're looking into something, one of the first things you do is go look at somebody's social media. And, if you go and look at his today, there's spam on it. And I'm obviously not a friend, and I did go take a look. It looks like it's been hacked, but yeah. And especially teenagers, like they usually do post all the time. So there could be plenty of information. You could even look at to see who liked his photos and look into who he's interacting with. That tells you a lot about a person. And a lot of times leads you to a lot of clues.
Look what happened. Alec was found guilty on a video.
Yeah, for social media.
As far as I could tell from the mate file, it wasn't even requested, wasn't even subpoenaed, wasn't even mentioned. And we do know from going through the mate report, through various interviews that were done, and this is the part where I just constantly just shake my head. When Sandy Smith gives names of somebody that tells her, hey, I saw this guy, Mike, at the crime scene driving really fast, going away and slowing down when he saw the blue lights. And then the police go and interview and find out who this Mark guy is, but they don't ever go talk to the Mike guy. Why was Mike at the crime scene? That to me is baffling. Mm-hmm. That's somebody that she put two people, and the gentleman who said he saw him, again, I don't even know how he knows Mark, tells Sandy, I see this gentleman at your son's crime scene, but no one wonders, well, what are you doing there? Mm-hmm. And never interviewed. Don't you find that crazy? And this Mike guy, and it's alleged that his ex-wife was Alec Murdoch's hairdresser. Is there a link there? Is there a reason why they're not going to him? They have his first and last name.
I didn't know that.
Why don't they go talk to him? Or is he off limits? At going to the off limits, this one really gets me. She specifically, when I say she, I say Sandy, specifically states how much time Stephen is spending with a boy named Kash. Doesn't say the last name, took a little time looking into it. Now you tell the police that your son is spending time with this boy named Kash, hanging out, going to the parties, going to Bobcat Landing. And Bobcat Landing, if you haven't heard in past episodes, was a known place for hooking up, and drugs were bought and sold there. So there wasn't a whole bunch of good, at least at that time period when Stephen was there and hanging out, that was actually happening there. And they never, ever, at any point in the police report, even mentioned going to see this person, Kash. I would imagine that was really, really important. These are the very few names were given that had contact with Stephen in the days and hours before he was murdered. And this particular name was said. Now, if you talk to locals, they will tell you that he is off limits. He's untouchable. I will quote that. They call him untouchable. He has been linked to money laundering. He's linked in other articles with Lafayette and money laundering, and looking through the investigation. And, he owns the gas station. It was the employees there would say that people would come in with a check, no ID, no nothing. And sometimes Alec Murdoch would even say, go ahead, I'll vouch for him. Go ahead, cash his check. And then they would say that DHL would come in an envelope. All those checks would be sent off to a bank in India. And then that's how it was done. So is that money laundering? He's openly linked to it. So there's money laundering with a guy named Kash, and Sandy states right in the police report what gas station, what he's, how much time they're spending together, and no one goes and speaks to him.
How old is Kash? How old is he?
I do not know that for a fact.
Do you know if he's like, was he closer to Steven's age or was he more middle aged?
No, he definitely looks, especially in the photos now, he looked like he could have been the same age. He's very, very
Really?
connected to Gregory Alexander. He was running for sheriff. He's now, I believe, a police chief in, I'm going to say it wrong, probably, is it Yemassee?
Yeah. Yemassee.
Yeah, he's police chief for Yemassee. So he's very, very connected. And there's pictures all over of Kash with Gregory Alexander, which just makes you wonder, is he really untouchable?
Wow. Yeah, I'm actually really interested to hear about the Kash part because I really haven't heard that much. I mean, you're the first person that I'm aware of media wise that has come out with that, although, you shared that with them. So they published that. And that's pretty much all I've known about him. Like, that's definitely a new name in this whole thing.
We could probably do a whole episode on just Kash and this alleged money laundering scheme that he seems to be linked to in several different articles, actually. But who else did intrigue you when you were reading through the report and listening to the audio interviews?
So actually, the one that did stand out the most to me was Mark. And I'll just not say his name, just I don't know how that stuff goes. But they did go, one of the investigators did go to his house and spoke to him. And so he's older than Stephen. I believe he was in his late 40s. He was either in his I think it was late 40s. And he spoke about having participated in escort type work also. And he mentioned a lot about Stephen being involved with an escort agency that he didn't say he knew which one, or Stephen had denied. He'd asked him if he was with the same one he had worked with, and Stephen had denied that. He did also talk a lot about some stuff popping up. I think there were some pictures of Mark himself that had popped up on Craigslist. And so the investigator was asking, had you guys been fighting? And he was like, well, we didn't fight, but we had a disagreement of what, of some form. I will say things from Mark are going to be tough to take because just my perspective, and I'm not saying any of this is true. This is just my perspective, and having been around people that use substances, he kind of sounded like he might actually have been on something at that moment. And he talked a lot about he couldn't remember some specific things that evening because Stephen was supposed to have gone to his house that night rather than ending up where he did in the middle of the road. So Mark was under the impression that Stephen was going there. He'd been on the phone with him. He felt like Stephen was around trucks. He described hearing like mud wheels or something like that, which
like large tires.
I'm not really familiar with that term. But and Stephen had said no, he wasn't anywhere like that. I think he said he was driving. But when you listen to Mark, he's one of those people where I feel like there's probably some decent core truths, some things in there, but it gets a little mixed up because he gets to points where you're like, this guy's maybe having an episode or he's a little unclear. And he's very open about they're like, why can't you be more specific about these important things? And he was like, well, I'd taken my Seroquel. And I don't know anything about Seroquel. I'm going to take a wild guess and think it's maybe a little bit like Ambien, where, if you take it, like you're going to be out soon. You're not going to know what's going on. I haven't looked up Seroquel, but that would be my guess with that. But he had some interesting things to say. He very much felt like he was in a relationship with Stephen. He wanted, I think, to know the family better, but I think he felt like Stephen kept him separate in that way. It was interesting. It's interesting because he felt like he was in a relationship later on in the investigation, you see there's another guy that also felt like he was in a relationship with Stephen. So that's kind of interesting. But what is really important about the Mark interview is Stephen's phone was on Mark's account. Mark said he was more than happy to cooperate with the investigation. He agreed to take a lie detector test, yet there's been no lie detector tests that I'm aware of to this day. And I don't know if it's because he didn't want to, or if it's because nobody actually called him back and arranged for that. We don't know that. All I know is he sounded completely happy to participate with everything. He sounded like he cared a lot about Stephen, and he did sound very upset to me. I didn't particularly find him suspicious. Another thing that was interesting, he said that he was getting these calls from the Cayman Islands, which that's another one of those things that, like, in the Murdoch thing, who knows, like, or like South Carolina world, maybe we shouldn't even say Murdoch at this point. Bizarre things happen. So he could have been getting bizarre calls from the Cayman Islands, but even the investigator was kind of like, that's a little far-fetched. But there is, in the mate report I was going through, and there was, he did, I think, make a report about like he had been harassed. And he said he and Stephen, it was interesting, in the earlier part of the investigation, people talk about how accepted Stephen was, how liked he was, how nobody really gave him a problem. But then when you listen to Mark, you do hear the flip side. Maybe all these straight people in his life felt that way because they just saw what it was like from their perspective. But when you talk to somebody who's also in that lifestyle, you're going to get a different perspective. And they weren't always accepted that way. There were people that would say nasty things to them. And a lot of times, Stephen, when Mark would get upset, Stephen said, don't, just let it go. Don't do anything about it. But yeah, I think he mentioned Stephen driving, like there was the SUV and then the smaller car. But and I think this guy a lot of times wasn't able to drive. So that was some of the issues. But it was an interesting, and we'll go through it in another episode at another time in more detail. But that was, I think, the meat and the potatoes of Mark. So he was the one who had it was his phone account that Stephen's phone was on. So to get those records, they wouldn't be getting it from Sandy or from anybody else. It would have to go through him. And I have no idea if that has anything to do with why we never heard more about the phone records or not. But he did sound completely happy to participate and cooperate. He just sounded like he might be in some different mental states. That was my assessment of the situation. Does that sound clear to you, Shannon? Like what was did you have any thoughts on Mark?
I have to tell you, I like Mark. I believe he was speaking the truth as he knew it. His memory is fuzzy. They were a little upset that he would remember certain things and not remember other things, but he would also not remember them at the moment they asked. But then things would come back to him. And when I described it, it almost sounds like maybe he was just making it up as he went. No, I don't think he was pulling a Murdoch. He truly has, in his drug use from the past, has the effects now. He's cleaned up. He's, doing his best, but the effects of the previous abuse are evident. And I think he was doing his best. And the one thing that you said, and I completely agreed with, he did not sound in any way to not want to cooperate. He was more than wanting to. I think the disconnect between the investigators and Mark was the communication. Mark trying to remember, and Mark not being able to remember as quickly on things. And then as he was talking, you would see that he would get that flash of the memory. And so it was very scattered. But if you listen to it, you felt for him. I felt for Mark. I did.
I did too. I mean, let me tell you, on a bad week for me, I can highly relate to Mark. I'm not saying I take anything, but when you get overwhelmed and you get scattered, like sometimes, and this is like a highly traumatic thing, and I don't have the substances to add in, but my goodness, like if you add substances in, it's good. Yeah, I could see that would be authentic. The other part that I did forget to mention that I probably should, He did mention that he felt like Stephen sounded like he had been drinking. And, the toxicology report said that there was nothing in his system.
It was
But
negative.
he seemed to like be very convinced he was drinking. And if I remember correctly too, it seemed like he went to bed fairly upset with him because he didn't hear from him. But he did say later the next day, it was odd that he just didn't hear from him at all. And I think he said like it was going straight to his voicemail, and that was unusual. And that was when he started to get concerned. I felt like he was telling the truth, and I could be completely wrong, but he did sound genuine and relatable to me. Doesn't mean he's not hiding something. He could be. I don't know. But overall, I found him relatable and believable.
I do have a thought. Stephen did tell his family and some of his friends that he was in a relationship with a man, a predominant man. Now, a lot of people have said it's Buster, but Buster and Stephen were peers. They were peers in school. They were of the same age. So to me, it just logically, if he was referring to Buster, I don't think he would have referred to Buster as a man, maybe a prominent person in my school. I don't know. But for him to say that he was in a relationship with a prominent man, and that if he said this man's name, he would be shot or injured or something. Just the fact that he says man makes me believe that if Stephen was in a relationship with somebody that was prominent in South Carolina and may have added to the reason he was murdered, I believe it would have been someone older than him, just by the use of the word man. To me, it's just a logical thing. For Stephen to say that. Stephen was 19 years old. If a 19-year-old is going to refer to somebody as a man, they're much older.
I
What do you
agree
think about that?
I 100% agree. I mean, we're talking about Mark's in his late 40s. He Sometimes people tend to like have a preference, and I mean, it looks like he did date older men. And Alex is older, and it's really interesting. I'm not saying that Alex is who he was dating. And it's just a little strange. So who knows? I mean, that's interesting. Alex is a prominent man. He's older. He was a baseball coach. Wasn't there something in there about
Something was mentioned. People had said that maybe he was having a relationship with a former baseball coach.
I would find it at this point in time more believable that he could have possibly been dating Alex even more than Buster.
Another person that I found it very interesting that they didn't dive into a little bit was the gentleman that Sandy referenced when she was trying to give the police the different people that Stephen had ever mentioned to her. And one of them was a boy named James. She mentioned that they had gotten into an argument in the past, but she thought that they had made up. And James, from what I'm gathering, he did have a previous relationship with Stephen. They did get into an argument. They had made up, but James was allegedly, from what I'm told, the one who introduced Stephen to David. David, if anybody has looked into the case, remember the gate pass to the apartment to go have a afternoon hookup relationship with a man. And they did, I believe it was Sandy that found that pass. And the police did go speak with David, and David was a married man and did not, he didn't want it out. He agreed to the interview, but he did have relation with Stephen. He did admit to that it was consensual. But then that goes back to, you've got a friend introducing him to this man that has children, and it was consensual. And then he leaves, going to Hilton Head Island. It just makes you wonder what was going on. Yes, people have said the little black book and the risky behavior. There's a lot of risky behavior by the part of a lot of people. What do you think?
Yeah, it sounds a little strange. And for those of you who don't know much about the different areas of South Carolina, Hilton Head is actually a very prominent area. Both Hilton Head and Beaufort are considered to be wealthier areas. Hilton Head is actually even more like a resort type town. There's it's one of those nice, kind of reminds me actually of if anybody's ever been to Sawgrass in Jacksonville, Florida. It's very much like that, but also like a little more historic-y feel. But it's a very, very prominent, wealthy area in comparison to say like Hampton.
Yeah.
That so yeah, I would, if my mind were to go there, I'd be wondering. My mind would probably be like, I wonder if he's just hanging out with wealthy parties, maybe wealthy men who want him to be at their parties.
He was a beautiful boy.
He was a really, yeah, he was a beautiful boy.
And it kind of hit me on this one. You're talking about Hilton Head. We're talking about, we know Stephen's lifestyle. We know the risky behavior. Even some of his acquaintances are dabbling in. And this is why I think the rape kit that was requested and performed on him during his autopsy, were they trying to make sure someone wasn't going to be found through any DNA evidence? Or was this a common thing to do? I still have so many questions on the rape kit, which was done, and SLED does have possession of this rape kit. We did not find the results of that.
Definitely an interesting take as well. Like, yeah, were they doing it just to be thorough? Or if maybe people involved with the investigation might not be on the up, like, were they doing it to try to like get the information and get rid of the information?
What other person stuck out to you in reading through the mate report, Kelly?
Buster came up a lot. Buster Murdoch. He was consistently brought up through the investigation. And I know that he recently made a statement saying that he wasn't involved, and he may not be, but it is awfully odd that his name was consistently brought up. And then there were things that occurred that one could possibly perceive as being a cover up, or to try to redirect the investigation, or to try to present the new culprit. And it involves his family. We can get into it. I mean, I believe Mandy Matney, FITSNews, I don't know who wants to take credit for that, but they did say that his name was mentioned over 40 times in the investigation. That's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, it could have been a rumor, but it certainly was something that came up through multiple people. What we do know is Buster was friends with Stephen. And I will tell you, Sandy has actually said very kind things about Buster before. She said that she knew him to be a very nice boy. She wasn't mean about him, but she was wanting answers. As far as we know, Buster was never interviewed in regards to any of this. Stephen used to kind of tutor Buster. So I feel like you have to really go and look deeper when it goes into the Buster part. As I said, he was mentioned over 40 times in this investigation. So one of the first people that was on the scene, didn't Randy turn up on the scene? Or did he just reach out?
No, he called Stephen's father while he was at the police station to identify his body. They hadn't even identified to say for sure it was Stephen, and he was receiving a call from Randy. And that was said by Sandy in, if you've read it, the letter that Sandy sent to the FBI. So that has been stated.
So just to be clear, I do not know that he was there. He may not have been there. He was the first to reach out. And I think what Sandy had mentioned that seemed also odd about it was, so PMPED is injury liability, typically a law firm for that. That's what they're famous for. But she said that he specialized in workman's comp. So he wouldn't be the first person to go and deal with something like this. Now, what I will say in Randy's favor is I have heard a lot of hospitable things that he has done in regards to helping people. I came across something just the other day, and I can't remember a specific detail, but it was several different things where he had gone out of his way to help people. So it's very possible that maybe he has a kind spirit, and maybe with Stephen being gay, maybe he felt like maybe it touched his heart and he wanted to reach out. Maybe he thought other lawyers might not because of Stephen's lifestyle. And it's just that's the Carolinas. So that's a possibility, but it does get a little more strange moving forward. So there was confession. There was a man named Darrell Williams, who his stepson, Patrick Wilson, he said his stepson, Patrick Wilson, had confessed to him that a boy named Sean Conley, and Sean Conley does live very close to where Stephen was found. So I get that part. They said that Sean Conley had hit and killed Stephen with his car. Where this gets tricky, Patrick Wilson was actually being charged. He was facing multiple murder charges, which eventually got dropped by judges that were deemed to be friendly, favorable to the Murdochs. And Patrick Wilson's attorney at that time was Corey Fleming, who we've heard a lot about with the Satterfields. It's also Alex's best friend and Paul's godfather. Moving forward into this, there were 2 lawsuits filed against Sean Conley by the Murdoch law firm. So you've got this boy who's allegedly been confessed. I don't think he himself confessed, but somebody confessed for him that he's the one that did it. While there's all this heat on the Murdochs because Buster has, I think it said that his name was mentioned in half the people that had been interviewed in regards to this case. So all of a sudden, the Murdochs seem to be bringing us a new possible culprit. And this culprit happens to have vehicle lawsuits filed against him by the Murdoch firm during this time. And then it eventually gets dropped. It's a little strange.
A little?
So to conclude, the only other suspect that has really come up in this, and it was confessed that he didn't confess it, but somebody confessed it for him, are people who were deeply, it could look to me and possibly a lot of other people that he was being coerced into that position. It looks a little strange. I believe I've read that Randy had told Darrell to go and tell the police this. So this wasn't just, it didn't seem organic or natural or authentic. I would say it's awfully strange that the family of the person who's most being looked at are the first ones to seem to hold someone in a compromising legal position and then get a confession to come out in regards to that person.
And then those charges get dropped.
Those charges were dropped. Yeah. It's very, very strange to me. But a lot of people are still talking about it. I mean, Sean Conley lived very close to where Stephen's body was found. But then, there's a question, was that intentional? Could somebody have had that foresight to make sure, what was that thought of in advance to make Sean Conley look like the person? I don't know.
There were other statements made that the boys were out shooting at signs and stuff and just getting in trouble and possibly coming close to almost shooting people. Just
this is a wild area.
Just a wild area. So there was a lot going on with that group. And of course, that's all alleged, but that's what was said also going on at that time, that there was some wild behavior going on with those boys. And yeah, I did read it. And I remember thinking, wow, that just seems like, okay, you've got this person that's basically telling on somebody else. And then all of a sudden, the very person they're telling on has traumatic charges against them. And that just gets dropped. And there's a Murdoch link, go figure. And when Kelly was saying that it was kind of a confession, it was Patrick told his stepfather, who was like a father to him, that Sean Conley was drunk and he hit something. He went back to see what it was, saw the police lights, decided not to, get involved and talk to the police. And then he went home. Sean called Patrick to tell him this. He was crying. to what happened. I think I hit somebody. And then when Sean went to tell, when Patrick went to tell, his father what had happened, he apparently was so upset he went outside and threw up. So then there was speculation, wow, is Patrick actually there? Did he see it? Or is he just being told a story and he's repeating a story? It was very, very sketchy.
But what's also interesting, to be fair, I don't know that they ever, I didn't see any interviews with Sean Connolly. Right?
This is my point. They get this information. They get these, you've got this mic at the crime scene. You've got these boys saying whatever they said. And then allegedly, Mr. Ginn took photos of the truck that had some side view mirror or, side mirror damage and sent it into the police station. And there's no record of those photos ever even arriving. It's all crazy that none of that was followed up on.
And was it intentional to do a switch and bait and then just have everything disappear? Was that part of a plan too? Is that part of how this system works? Is like, well, you're going to do this for us. You're going to take the fall, but don't worry. We'll get you in the end as long as you just cooperate and stay still. And then everything will go back. Like people will forget about it. I don't know. That's another option. But like, if we were to play the devil's advocate and say it wasn't Buster, because we certainly don't know that it is, and perhaps this person is a decent suspect. I didn't see anywhere in there where they interviewed him. I didn't even see, did you see an interview with Patrick Wilson? Did I miss that?
No.
Yeah, so he wasn't, it's just his stepdad. Like, that's a pretty big lead for somebody to not go and look into.
One thing, and it occurred to me when you were just saying that, the bait and switch and the, let the public think this, look over here while they're not looking over there. If you refer back to Sandy's letter to the FBI, her original letter, when she was begging for help and support in finding who murdered her son, the one line in there that I thought was very interesting, she says, Hampton investigators asked us at the time to continue to publicly say it was a hit and run. That to me was strange.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted her to keep saying that.
So what are we trying to create a narrative? Like, it's hard. I mean, honestly, getting into this, I don't even know if you say case, getting into these South Carolina, at this point, it's South Carolina crime stuff, your head gets completely boggled. And so much of it is like, how much is this being done to create confusion? I mean, is that a tactic even, Because let me tell you, it's a lot to retain all this information. I mean, there was, when that all first started, my brain was doing a good job, but then some life stuff happened and it's hard to like keep track of all this stuff. And is that intentional?
Something that you said that is just so evident to me, especially when I was starting to look at this file for the first time myself. There is just so much amount of information and so many question marks that just go bing, bing, bing off in your head as you're reading it. It takes you on a turn this way. It takes you on a turn that way. Fake calls here, other allegations there. And people listening and watching, I can only imagine how confusing it sounds to you when we're talking about these different statements being made and you don't know what we're looking at or what we're reading. How confusing that must be to you. So Kelly and I would really like to break down this file for you. It's long, it's extensive. We'll do it slowly, but we would like to break down this entire case file with you, page by page, item by item, statement by statement. So you too, you have the knowledge to then start putting the pieces together in your head. So we thank you all very much for your support and being with us today as we covered this. And we look forward to covering the entire file with you on a later episode. So thank you very much, everybody.